Listeners, a very special guest is with me today. He is, I was about to say he used to be a good friend of mine. He still is a good friend of mine.
Absolutely.
And we crossed over journeys very early in our business, professional lives, didn't we?
Yeah, it would be my second or third year, I reckon, in practice.
Yes, there we go. So, introducing Dr. Nick Gentile, chiropractor and scoliosis clinician.
It's a mouthful, but you got it.
Yes, stoked. How are you, mate?
I'm well, really well.
Awesome.
Glad to have you here in my, my home.
Thank you for having us.
Well, it's not my home. It's where I work.
It's a beautiful view, actually.
It's really nice.
Very lovely.
Really nice.
Mate, can you introduce yourself to our listeners? What is it that you do on a daily basis? And let's go from there.
So my training is in chiropractic. So I'm registered as a chiropractor. I don't really... It depends how philosophical you get about chiropractic, right?
Yeah.
So for me, the biggest part of chiropractic is assessing patients, seeing patients, putting through a care plan. The smallest part of a chiropractor is actually how you deliver your therapy. So traditionally that's an adjustment, either with your hands, with a device, with a table, something like that. What I do now is I do the 90% of chiropractic and the 90% of your training, but my delivery is in scoliosis management. So that's through scoliosis bracing and scoliosis rehab.
Yep.
So I don't do any manual adjusting, any adjusting at all of patients now in practice. I do for family and friends and that sort of thing, but it's all management of scoliosis, so very, very specialised now.
Fantastic. And so when you were practicing as a chiropractor, was that a conscious decision that you made to go down that particular niche of scoliosis?
So it's interesting because, as you know, with your career, it kind of changes and evolves. And with manual therapy, chiropractic, osteo, physio, well, physio not so much. It's a bit more open in Australia for where your career can go. But particularly with chiropractic, osteo, those sorts of things, generally your career path is into private practice, and you generally stay there for the majority of your career. If you complete your career as a manual therapist, a lot of people drop out and go into other things. So there's not really avenues for you to diversify within your own career field.
Yep.
So it was never really in my thought space that maybe one day I would still be a chiropractor, but not actually adjusting people. I'd be in a more specialised role. And it kind of came into my consciousness sort of around COVID, around 2020, where Scolicare was looking for a new clinician. And I thought, oh, you know what? This is something that is interesting to me and I'd love to learn more about, and I'd love to jump in and see how we go with that. And ultimately it's been the best decision I ever made, because really enjoying the whole process, really enjoying working for the company, all those sorts of things.
Fantastic, man. And take us back to, a young Nick in high school.
Yeah.
Going, okay, what is it that I want to do in my next chapter, and why chiropractic or this kind of work?
So how meandering do you want to go?
We love a good meander on this podcast.
So if I'm brutally honest,
Yeah.
the reason I studied biology, PE, all those sort of health sciences is because I used to read comic books as a kid.
Yep.
And my favourite comic books were X-Men. And that was all about evolution and all about human potential, essentially. And so that really piqued my interest.
Yep.
And so from there, I started getting into sport, really loved playing footy, really loved injury management and those sorts of things. So finishing high school, I was like, oh no, I definitely want to do something like chiro, osteo, physio. And it wasn't until I was studying health sciences at uni, and I was on a TV show may or may not have been called Shopping for Love, right? So I meet the host of this TV show, lovely lady named Andy Liu, and was just talking about, I'm studying health sciences, I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. I've been thinking about chiro or physio or whatever. And she goes, oh, my husband's a chiropractor, you've got to come hang out in our practice. And so it's like, okay, cool. So
fantastic.
I rock up to this lady's practice in Elwood a few weeks later, and this place for a 20-year-old Nick was just incredible. I don't know if these practices are still able to run this way anymore, but this was an open plan practice and just covered in what we would call holism now. So it's just about wellness and looking at the body as a whole unit and what's interacting, what's making you healthy, what's making you unhealthy. And the thing that I really loved about that and the time that I spent with this chiropractor was chiropractic philosophy. And that is essentially, if your spine works well, the communication between your brain and your body works really well, and that's the building block of good health. You add other things on top of that. You've got to have good sleep, good diet, exercise, all those other things. But that's the internal building block that then grows from there. And I was hooked from that moment. I'm like, oh,
fascinating.
This philosophy, although the science that they had at the time when they developed the profession was not up to speed of where it is now, the more that we're discovering, in my mind, just reinforces that philosophy of looking, being proactive about your health, making sure that your nervous system's communicating. And the original thought process was that the spine presses on the nerve, which affects the organ. What we know now is it happens more centrally. It happens in the brain. But the adjustment of the spine affects the brain. So it's not pressure on a hose. It's more central computer, and you're recomputing it with, or reprogramming it with adjustments.
Amazing. And this is only a recent finding?
So this is more modern neuroscience. Yeah. So it's irresponsible for me to talk about the dates, but I've only just become aware of it in sort of the last 7 to 10 years. But I would say it's been at least 20 years that this, what we call functional neurology, is starting to be developed. And I think the real push behind it is this guy called Carrick in the US, and he's a chiropractor and developed all this technique and learning process. But it's incredible stuff and really steeped very deeply in just neuroscience.
Yeah, cool. So you're in Elwood, you meet this amazing guy, practice is incredible, blows your mind.
Yeah.
And then that's when you decide you want to specialise in chiropractic art?
Yeah, so that's when I started. I finished my health science degree. I got into chiropractic, deferred it for a year, finished my health science degree, and then jumped into chiro and worked for this guy in Elwood as a chiropractic assistant for really the entirety that I was studying uni. So I got this really good grounding of the university education of the science of chiropractic, RMIT. Really incredible, straight down the line, not philosophical at all. And that was balanced for me really well by this incredibly philosophical based practice and this mentor. So I got sort of the best of both worlds.
Yeah, yin and yang.
Yeah, because I think you get caught when you're stuck on either end of the spectrum. If you're too scientific as a chiropractor, and that can sound really silly, that why wouldn't you want the most scientific chiropractor? You definitely want them to know what they're doing. But without the philosophy, that treatment approach and that patient communication can sometimes fall by the wayside, and vice versa. If you're too on the other end, then and you're ignoring the science and just adjusting people according to dogma, then you're not doing the best thing for the patient either. So I was really lucky, maybe it's fate, who knows, depends how you look at the world, to really get that balancing of both. And that, I think, kept me really well centred and down the middle.
It's interesting, mate, because to my knowledge currently, I don't believe there's a course in Victoria that is offering chiro anymore. You have to go interstate.
Yeah, that's really contentious at the moment because RMIT just announced a couple months ago that they're not continuing with chiropractic. And I do know a few of the details, but I can't really go into them because I can't tell you how I know the details. But it's really sad for the profession because the RMIT historically, it was the first university program in Australia to run chiropractic, and I think potentially in the world, first university-based program. And for it to end is just really sad for the history of chiropractic in Australia, let alone the practicalities of people from Melbourne and Victoria. They can't go to uni in Melbourne anymore.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the demand for practitioners in a few years' time, based on the fact that it's quite hard to study and you have to make that choice of going interstate or choosing another discipline at this point. And
there's definitely good programs outside of Victoria for sure. And so you still, if you want to become a chiropractor, you're still going to get a really good education. It's just not going to be in Bundoora. But I don't know if you've been to Bundoora recently. Maybe that's a good thing.
No disrespect to Bundoora listeners.
Well, actually, to be fair, Bundoora, I was there on the weekend. It is way better than when I was at uni. There's so much more going on than there was back then.
Oh, I love that.
I was just driving, my wife's American. We're driving back through Bundoora. We're actually visiting my sister in South Morang. And it's like, I said to Ash, man, 10 years ago, all of these shopping centres, all these houses, this was paddocks. It was empty. And now there's so much more going on. So maybe you're sad that RMIT doesn't have it anymore.
It's funny. Little story. When my wife and I got married, she grew up in Lower Plenty.
Yeah.
And one of her family friends came up to me. He's like, "Oh, where are you going on your honeymoon?" And I was like, "Oh, we're thinking about, I don't know, maybe Bunjalong." And he's just like, "I thought you were about to say Bundoora." And I was like, "Oh," and he goes, "Oh, wouldn't be going there for my honeymoon." But no doubt there's good people out in Bundoora, and Latrobe and RMIT out there are doing cool things now.
Yeah.
But mate, take us through like what a typical day looks like. So quite often I think people assume, you get a patient in, you go adjust, see, enjoy the rest of your day. There's got to be more to it than that.
Yeah. So do you want a typical day for me now or a typical chiropractic day?
Can we go two parts? So typical chiropractic day and then your typical day now?
Yeah, for sure. So a typical chiropractic day varies from practice to practice, but in most practices I worked in, you would have adjusting sessions, right? Particularly in an open plan practice where there's just tables there, people come in and lie down, which I love for a whole heap of different reasons in terms of the way it builds community and energy. It's not great for patient privacy if they want to discuss something or something like that. So I typically haven't practiced in open plans, but I do love them from a philosophical point of view. I think they're great, just not from a medico-legal point of view. So typically you'll have an adjusting session first thing in the morning. So chiropractic day will be sort of 7 till 12 will be the first session. And so of that 7 till 9 or 10 in the morning will be just adjustments booked. So whether you're working out of 1 room or 2 rooms, people coming in for their general routine adjustments, which are typically sort of 10 to 15 minute appointments. So you'll do that until 9:30 or 10 o'clock, and then you'll have an hour or two set aside just for longer appointments. So re-examinations or initial consultations. So this is when you've set your schedule of care. So for the first 6 weeks, for example, it might be you're seeing someone twice a week for 6 weeks. They've had they've gone through their first 12 adjustments, and then they come in for a re-exam. Have we gotten to the point of progress that we're looking for? Are your symptoms improved? Is your function better? Those sorts of things. And then you set the next phase of care for them. That would be a typical re-exam. And then, of course, an initial consultation, someone comes in, my back hurts, my neck hurts, I want to feel better. How do we go about this? And that's when you do your full assessment. So your neurological assessment, your orthopedic assessment, your functional assessments, all those sorts of things that when you're ruling out, really most of our training, I always say this to people, is we go to uni for 5 years. It's not to learn how to crack people's necks. You go to uni for 5 years so that you know when someone's not supposed to be in your practice. That's definitely the most important thing.
Interesting.
And the things I remember the most are when someone's come in and I've sent them on because they've got a broken arm or they've got something really nasty like cancer or what was the most bizarre? Hodgkin's lymphoma was the one I diagnosed that was the most bizarre.
Right.
So that's what your training's about.
Yep.
Training's about, when is this person not a chiropractic patient?
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Because I remember when I saw you as a patient and then I've seen another one down the peninsula and it's it's very holistic quite often and it's like, do you experience trouble sleeping? Do you experience headaches? Like headaches is a big one.
Yeah.
And then there's also what I've noticed, like there's like adjustments for your neck, adjustments for your back and the way in which you how much time you spend in the car and how are you, I suppose, keeping your central nervous system in check, essentially.
And because so much of our modern lifestyle is just not conducive to good health, driving, using phones, sitting at desks, all that sort of stuff. So all those questions are really relevant because they have an impact on how long it's going to take you to improve for whatever the current problem is, right? And so that's the majority of that initial consultation is finding out about the person, really getting to know someone, right? And then part of that, really important part of that is actually what do they want to get out of care? Because I know what I want them to achieve as a chiropractor, but that's not necessarily what they want to achieve.
Yeah.
So I want them to be optimally healthy and I want them to only eat green vegetables and drink filtered water and eat organic meat and sleep 9 hours a day, right? But that's not necessarily why they're there. Some patients are there just because something hurts.
Yep.
And that, like I was saying before, when you're far down the other end, the philosophical end, you're trying to push these people into a lifestyle that they're not congruent with. And you've got to meet people where they're at and show them that, this next step's possible, but we've got to start with where you're at. and it makes sense to you.
Yeah, interesting. That's cool. Like, I feel like there's a new wave of medical practitioners, clinicians in multiple disciplines where they're taking on this philosophical side as well as the scientific side. And it's like this beautiful relationship around this is what the science says, but this is also, you know, perhaps not as concrete in data, but word on the street essentially is that there's things that are contributing to your overall health.
And it's really funny because you often hear news articles come up, or you hear on the news that like, oh, we found that eating processed foods is bad for you. It's like, thank you, Captain Obvious, but that's how research works, right? It takes so long for that information to actually come out that it's like, we already knew that. And so that's why having that balance between holism and science is really important, and you can't be too far on either end. Because if you're too far down the science, then you're going to be doing things that are actually not good for people, even though the science says it's okay. And so you've got to have that balance of, what do I inherently know about being a healthy human? What does my knowledge give me about being a healthy human? And how do I apply that in a really scientific and clinical way so that we get the best results for the patients?
Fantastic. And so now your typical day, what does that look like at Scolicare?
Yeah, so rather than having that 2 sessions and that split in the middle, and then potentially you'd have another adjusting session, and then at the end of the morning you'd have a longer appointment session, and you'd sort of mirror that in the evenings. You'd have, but almost in reverse. So you'd start with longer appointments, do an adjusting session, longer appointments, and then finish the day with an adjusting session because you want to catch people before and after work, before and after school.
That's a good point. So you're trying to be flexible with other people's time as well, aren't you?
And so you will end up with a sort of a 2 to 3 hour gap typically, or you do half days. You do a half day in the morning, half day in the afternoon, depending on how you schedule. So a typical day for me is, and this was one of the things that attracted me to the role, is it's 9 to 5. So because we are a specialised clinic, people don't come and see us as frequently, but typically will take time out of the day to come and see us because it's a more specific and more specialised problem. So my bookings are pretty free form. So typically I'll see either return patients or new patients. New patients I'll set aside an hour and a half in the day. So we'll typically do an hour and then give them some time to go just down the street to get some x-rays and come back if they haven't got their own relevant x-rays. Scoliosis needs some specific images, so very regularly patients will have x-rays but they don't show the full picture. And then interspersed with that will be half an hour follow-up appointments. So with scoliosis we follow people every 3 months, with x-rays every 6 months. And we do sort of in the 3-month follow-ups, we'll assess how they're going, have a look at their posture, have a look at some x-rays if it's an x-ray review appointment, make any adjustments to the care that we need. So I'll either change the way that their rehab is happening, I'll make some changes to their brace, I'll make some changes to maybe the time that they're spending in the brace, those sorts of things. So, but it doesn't have those sessions that were typically set aside in the standard chiropractic practice.
Cool. Mate, what is scoliosis?
Yeah, good question.
Because I feel like it's a term that probably gets thrown around a lot and people don't necessarily know what that means or what that implies on the body.
So there's 2 general categories.
Yep.
You can have a pathological scoliosis, which is really complex to go into, but essentially that's a scoliosis that is secondary to a different disease. So this is very common in someone with cerebral palsy who doesn't walk. And so because they're in a wheelchair and the way that they sit and their low muscle tone, it'll create a curve in their spine. What we're talking about typically, and is probably 80% of my patients, is what we call idiopathic scoliosis, which is a deformity of the spine as you grow. So essentially it's a wedging and twisting of one or more vertebra, which then over time creates a sort of a C curve or an S curve through the spine. Right. So it's a disease of growth functionally, and then obviously when you've got a scoliosis, if you become an adult, you stop growing, you still have the scoliosis. So then it goes on to chronic management of that condition. With teenagers, we can, depending on lots of different factors around the scoliosis, we can see some improvement with treatment in teenagers, but and people who are growing. In adults, it's more about lifestyle management and how do you live your best life with your scoliosis.
Yeah. And you were making reference about braces and things like that. Like what are some of the treatments for scoliosis?
Yeah, so there's there's a whole heap. I feel in Australia and really around the world, there's a big gap in the understanding of conservative management of scoliosis. Typically, it's observe scoliosis if you're not growing until the point where you need an operation. There's a little bit more understood with people who are growing, teenagers, those sorts of things. But essentially, depending on the type of scoliosis and the magnitude of your scoliosis, we're either doing specific rehab exercises to strengthen you, help you change your posture and keep you in good position, or we're combining that with bracing. So in order to, on very basic terms, growth modulate the spine. So we're holding the spine in place so it grows a little bit straighter and we take some pressure off those vertebrae that are deforming. In really, really basic terms.
Yeah, fascinating. If you were to, if we've got like a young person listening or educators listening going, okay, we need more health practitioners, specifically chiros and scoliosis clinicians, what would you say are the fundamental skills that go into those professions? To me, it seems like you need a balance of scientific analysis, and what comes with that is like communication, asking appropriate questions, listening specifically to what the client is or the patient is saying and not saying, perhaps. But love to hear it from your perspective.
Yeah, so I've done a heap of, because I just find this area of human psychology interesting, but I've done a lot of extra training in communication just because I like working out what makes people tick. And that's the thing that I find most fascinating with patients, right, is having a chat to them and really getting an understanding. Like they'll come into you with back pain, but really the issue is not the back pain. It's because they can't play with their kids or they can't play golf or, it makes them think, oh, if I've got this back pain at 32, what does that mean when I'm 70? And there's all these other fears and beliefs kind of tied into it. And really unpacking that is when you get the best results. And so I think we're making the assumption that you've got the clinical and technical skills that you get from a university course on becoming a practitioner, chiro, osteo, physio, whatever it is. So you've already got those down pat. The most important thing that you can get is communication skills, rapport building and communication skills. Because you work with teenagers all the time, and I think that's one of my strengths is that I look like an adult, but I'm actually a kid. Right?
Playful excitement.
Yeah, in reality, I'm a kid. And so I think one of my strengths as a clinician is that I can connect with teenagers really well.
Yeah.
And rapport building, communication, and really getting them to understand, getting inside their head and saying, how can I explain this to you in a way that makes sense to you? And how can I prescribe this treatment in a way that connects to your values and makes you want to do it? Because if you consider bracing, it's a really tough process. So I really feel for these kids because, in my opinion, the cure is often worse than the disease. So if you think about as a teenager, you've got to wear a brace 23 hours a day. You're going through a period of your life when you're the most uncomfortable with who you are as a person.
Yep.
And it's like, oh, sorry, mate, you just got to wear this big plastic brace 23 hours a day, wear it to school with all your peers, because if you don't, you might need an operation.
Yep.
And so the success comes from making the patient understand that why they're doing it and trying to get them to want to do it. Because definitely I have cases where they just don't wear their brace enough, and there's a whole heap of reasons behind that. But I also have other cases where they get really good results because they're doing their rehab and they're wearing their brace. And it's a long process. So when you're 14 years old, you might have to wear this brace for 2 or 3 years.
Right.
So when you're 14, that's a long time.
Yeah.
When you're 37, 3 years is not really a big deal. And so managing this person through that process with the ups and downs of having good brace wear, good compliance, poor brace wear, poor compliance, making them feel okay at either end of those sorts of things. It's really people management that's the biggest skills and the biggest attribute that you can have. And this is true of general chiropractic as well, because often people are coming in and they think, oh, I'm getting adjusted 3 times a week and it's not changing much and this is not happening. And being able to communicate with them every visit while they're going through this process is so key to not only making sure that they stay in care and get the results that they're after, but also don't get disgruntled with the process and then say, oh, chiropractic doesn't work. I did it for so long and did this. And part of that is also listening to the patient and again, meeting them where they're at and getting a really clear picture of what do you want out of your chiropractic care? I know what I want out of your chiropractic care, but what do you actually want? And being humble in your treatment enough to put your own ego aside and no, I'm here to serve this person for them.
Yep. Yeah, I love that. Mate, that you've just reminded me of a situation in high school where I think there was a young person in my year level that had scoliosis, but no one knew what that was when you're in year 8.
Yeah.
And that must be so hard for a young person because teenagers and young people can be savage when it comes to, that if you're not normal or whatever that is within your school cohort, it's like you're a easy target.
Yeah.
Is that a big side that you find with your patients that you're working with where it's almost like you're the counsellor to them as well? Like if they're going through like a difficult experience with whatever type of frame or rehab that they have to use?
And so I stay really closely within my scope of practice, and as soon as I'm seeing warning signs that they actually need proper counselling and proper help, then that's definitely where I refer on because I think you're much better to get ahead of that from a mental health point of view than to be trying to chase it. So, but it is a big part of it. A big part of my role is encouragement, making sure that they feel like they're not doing great or they feel like they're going too well and those sorts of things, is making sure you just keep balance on the whole process. Because it's not only difficult for the patient, it's difficult for the family.
Yeah.
It's difficult because the parents feel like they need to make sure that they're wearing the brace and feel like they need to nag them, make sure they're doing their rehab and those. And so that creates tension between the parents and the children, sometimes between the parents themselves. It's a really, really tough process. And that's why I said the cure is often worse than the disease, because the whole process around it is really difficult, particularly if you don't get someone with the right mindset around their treatment. And that, I would say is probably the biggest part of my role.
Yeah, fascinating. Where do you see the future of chiro and scoliosis care heading? Like, is AI and automation, does that aid your process, or with like 3D printing and things like that?
3D printing is the big one.
Yeah.
Because at the moment, it takes about 6 weeks for a brace to arrive. Yep. And if you think about, that's fine for an adult that we're putting in a brace, but for a teenager or even younger, they can grow so much in that time. And I was at a scoliosis conference earlier this year, and we're already starting to see the advent of use of 3D printers. And that's incredible for a number of reasons. Number one, you can put someone in a brace almost straight away, like 8 hours.
Yeah, wow.
If the braces that the 3D print aren't quite of the same quality as yet, but I mean, 5 years from now, they absolutely will be. And so you can put someone in a brace almost straight away, which is amazing. And then the next part of that is, okay, we've seen some good change with your spine. We want to make these modifications to the brace to get a better correction or see what's going on there. Just print another brace. So you can then redesign the brace to push for the curve as it is at that point, rather than trying to modify the current brace for the practicalities of the cost, the lead-in time, those sorts of things. I mean, I have had a few patients that parents are very wealthy, and so they'll make subsequent braces when appropriate because finances aren't an issue. And so like, yep, cool, we'll just make another brace. But that's not the reality for 95% of the patients. And with 3D printing, I think that will become more and more possible. It's like, yep, we want to change this about what the brace is doing. Let's make another brace. And I think that's incredibly exciting.
Yeah. That's cool, man. Mate, it's been a pleasure chatting to you. I'm mindful of time too because you fitted us in before your first appointment in about 10 or so minutes.
Yeah.
But last question I want to ask you, or two questions. We ask all of our guests, the question of what are you roaring about, to pay respect to my dear co-founder who's no longer with us. And he used to have this saying, what are you roaring about? So just got to play his theme music to honour him.
Taco. I'm roaring.
Awesome. So, mate, what are you roaring about when you're not roaring about, holistic health, scoliosis, chiropractic? What else do you roar about?
So my current obsession, apart from, the obvious one is being a dad, right? I've got a 2-year-old and she's so fun. Yeah. We just had Halloween last night and just watching her go bananas whenever any trick-or-treaters came to the door and just chucking out lollies at people. That was very fun. And so every day is like a little adventure with her. So I am loving that at the moment. But that's a really easy one. All parents will say something like that. Yeah. The other thing that I'm really loving at the moment is I'm a big nerd, right? And so I play a lot of tabletop games. And I'm playing a new one, or relatively new, kind of. It's about 18 months old. Well, actually, it's 4 years old. But anyway, the community is quite new. Yeah. And so what I'm really excited about is, apart from that hobby itself, is the whole community building aspect and growing the player base. And how do you make that an inclusive community? And how do you find new people? And how do you connect new people? Because so many of my really, really good friends I've met through tabletop gaming over years and years and years. And I've made so many interesting connections with people overseas in all walks of life that do all sorts of different things. And so more so than the hobby itself, it can be anything. It can be golf, it can be surfing, it can be whatever it is. But just being at the center of growing a community and being able to shape that in a positive way to some extent. And then also, like a garden, just seeing it grow on its own as well,
come into fruit.
Yeah, is a really exciting and interesting part. And we're kind of toying with what generates discussion, what generates growth. How can we work towards, what are the things that are working well? How can we do more of those? What are the things not working well? How can we tweak those? And so it's really interesting growing a community and trying to actively grow a community. That's very, very fun at the moment.
Oh, that's cool. Well, Dr. Nick, thank you so much, mate.
My pleasure.
Really good to see you.
Always a pleasure.
How can people see your updates or get in contact with Scolicare?
So just the Scolicare website, scolicare.com is really good. I'm on LinkedIn, so you just look for me on LinkedIn, Dr. Nick Gentile. So I'll come up there and you'll see all my Scolicare stuff. And that's about, I don't really have any public Twitter pages or Facebook pages or anything like that. And very much just LinkedIn and on the website. But if you suspect you have scoliosis or something like that, just book an appointment and come in and see us.
Perfect. Mate, thanks so much.
My pleasure.